Okay, can you guys hear me? Good, okay. Welcome back. Quick question. How many of you are here from, and probably not many I would assume, South America? Anywhere in South America? Any countries? Dang it. I'm trying to get a Write the Doc South America going. Because how super fun would that be? Our next speaker is Shaun McCance. Welcome, Shaun.
All right, good morning. My name is Shaun McCance. I work for Red Hat. I'm going to talk to you about crossing the streams. Now, this has nothing to do with killing the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. Sorry for Ghostbusters fans. I'm going to be talking about how we can enable documentation to flow between upstream open source projects, community-built projects, and downstream commercial products that are built on top of them. So a little background about me, who I am. I'm at Shaun M on Twitter, SHAUNM. You can follow me right now. There's bullet points up here. I'm not going to read them all, but basically, I do open source documentation. I've been doing open source documentation for quite some time, and I've worked with a number of open source documentation projects, which brings me to shameless plug. I happen to also run a conference, the Open Help Conference in Sprints. It's a discussion-oriented conference, part unconference, 3 days of team sprints, all open source. Ran for 5 years, 2010 to 2015. We're taking a year off this year. Taking a year off because running a conference is like a lot of work. Which, by the way, if you see any of the organizers wearing their bright lanyards, please give them a big thank you. They do a whole lot of work to make this happen. So, yeah, right on. Twitter account. Go ahead and follow it if you want to find out about next year. Okay, shameless plug over. If my clicker works, there we go. So I got my start with the GNOME project. Way back in 2003, I took over as the documentation team lead for GNOME. And back in those days, we wrote these big docbook manuals with deeply nested sections and section numbers. So you'd have like section 3.14.1.5.9 to copy a file. No one really likes reading that. No one really likes writing that. But we had a much bigger problem, and that's that GNOME was really functioning as an upstream to a lot of different Linux distributions or even FreeBSD operating systems. Right? People didn't go download GNOME. They went and downloaded Fedora or Red Hat Linux back in the day, or Debian or SUSE or Ubuntu or whatever, right? So they went and got their Linux distribution, which happened to feature GNOME as its user interface. But all of these distributions were modifying it and changing it. The user experience was different from distro to distro. And that's less so these days. With GNOME 3, we've really drained the swamp, and we've created a unified user experience, so there's much less variation these days between distros. But back in those days, in the days of GNOME 2, GNOME was a bucket of parts. And so each distro would take our developer platform and our applications and our panel, and they'd tweak the panel setup, and they'd add their own apps, and they'd add their own system config tools. And we needed to be able to provide documentation for all of that, right? Fedora might add a system config tool to set the date and time, because for some reason we didn't have that upstream, right? So we needed docs for that, and it doesn't make sense to ask the user to go look at the GNOME manual for this set of tasks and the Fedora manual for this set of tasks. That's an arbitrary implementation detail. It doesn't make any sense to a user. So we needed to be able to present a unified help center that gave them all of the things that they needed to do, regardless of where that came from, so that multiple sources, GNOME as an upstream, and our distros, and even plugin developers and stuff, could add stuff in, and you would just have a single unified help system. So we developed a new help system, new in those days. It's almost 10 years old now. It's called Mallard. That's the logo. That's the Twitter handle, which you can follow. That's also the logo. That's the URL. So Mallard allows you, whoa, all right. So Mallard allows you to create topics and just drop them into a document. And the navigation, the categorization structure is created automatically from the metadata within all of these topics. So, and I'm sorry, Balcony, I'm a Cubs fan, but I'm not Jake Arrieta. There's no way I'm getting a ball up there. So So Mallard is unique in that respect, in that it allowed us to create a single unified help system from disparate sets of topics from different sources. Now, I'm not going to go into the technical details. This is not a tools talk, and I'm not here to talk about Mallard, but it does really inform how I go into all of these other documentation projects, even when they're using different formats and different tools, right? I come at it from this kind of topic-oriented, assembling things kind of perspective. All right, I work for Red Hat. Red Hat is the largest open source company. We build enterprise products from open source projects. All of our software is open source. Every single line of code we write, we put it out there open source. Sometimes we buy companies that have proprietary products, and we open source that. Sometimes it takes a little time because of like legal stuff that I don't do, right? But we do open source everything we do, and we've got a mantra in Red Hat of upstream first. And that means that we do all of our development work first in the upstream open source projects. We don't do our work on our downstream products and then when it's ready, throw it over the wall and just do a big code dump on GitHub. Everything happens first in the upstream. So what do I do for Red Hat? Well, we've got a team at Red Hat, and they take care of the documentation for all of our products, for the things we sell. I don't work for that team. I work for another team that takes care of our upstream projects. And my job is to go into these upstream open source projects and help them have really good documentation. Obviously, I cannot possibly write all of the documentation for all of our upstream projects myself. We have a lot of upstreams. I'm the only person who's working in this role of the upstream documentation person. So what I do is I go into these communities and I try to build up documentation communities. And some of those people in the community will be Red Hat people. Some of them will be employees of other companies, possibly competitors of ours. And some of them will just be volunteer community members, enthusiastic users that want to give back, contribute to the software that they're using. So I build up these documentation communities to create good docs upstream. And then I have a secondary goal, which is to help make our upstream documentation reusable in our product docs so that we can actually use some of that content and not rewrite it. And I have two reasons for this. One, I really do want our product docs to be good. If our product docs are good, our products sell well, that makes us profitable, that's in my best interest. I get a paycheck. But also, more to the point of my actual job, if I can remove the barriers to content reuse between upstream and downstream, then our product documentation team has an incentive to work in the upstream. I can actually get them working on upstream documentation. It's not reasonable to expect them to go work on the upstream documentation and then set all that aside and then go work on their product docs. That doesn't make any sense, right? They're a small team, they don't have enough people, they've got product deadlines to make. I can't expect that of them. But if they can pick up the upstream docs, a lot of which they didn't even have to write, and just drop it into the product docs, maybe change a few product names, do some curation work on it, they've got a lot of content for free, and now all of a sudden it's worth their while to contribute upstream, and I get more people working upstream, I win. So I keep talking about streams, upstream, downstream. Let's take a look at what some of these look like. I am terrible at drawing stuff, by the way. So this is one of our products, Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization. It's a way to run a virtual data center. You can spin up and manage virtual machines. It's fed directly from the Overt project. So Overt has a few things that feed into it, libvirt, KVM, but Overt is the user experience. That's the upstream open source project that multiple people work on. We take it, we do a lot of QA work on it, put it on top of our enterprise Linux operating system. That's Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization. Same idea here. These are two separate streams, also very easy ones. We have two storage products for horizontally scaling big data storage, Red Hat Gluster Storage, Red Hat Ceph Storage. They're fed directly from Gluster and Ceph, respectively. Same idea, QA work, put it on top of enterprise Linux, and there's our products. All right, a little bit more complicated. I'm sure plenty of you have heard of OpenStack. It's kind of a big deal right now. It's like the big hotness out there. OpenStack allows you to manage a private cloud, a large data center that scales horizontally. And it has a lot of different components. It's really an umbrella project. So it has a component for managing virtual machines. It has components for doing object storage, for doing block storage, distributed databases, identity management, orchestration, monitoring. I used to have in my head all of the OpenStack projects, and it just grows exponentially. I can't possibly keep track of it. Now, OpenStack, if you're doing an OpenStack deployment, you're not going to use all of these pieces. Nobody uses all of these pieces at the same time. You pick and choose what you need for your particular deployment. So every OpenStack deployment is really this precious, beautiful snowflake. And that's great because it means there's a lot of flexibility, right? You can do whatever the heck you want with it. But it creates a lot of difficulties, both from a documentation perspective, how the heck do you document all that, but also from a perspective of trying to sell a product that you can deploy easily. If you tell people they have to do all of this work just to get it up and running, that's a very hard sell on people. So Red Hat sponsors the RDO project. This is an upstream open source project that you can contribute to right now. And they do packaging and integration work around OpenStack. So they create packages that you can run on Enterprise Linux or Fedora or CentOS or whatever else. And they do integration work where they pick various back-end technologies so that you don't have to worry about all of that stuff if you don't want to. And then RDO feeds directly into our Red Hat OpenStack platform. Same idea, we do QA work on that and release an enterprise product. So in this case, our product has an upstream. And the upstream is somewhat Red Hat-centric, but the upstream itself has its own upstream. That's a very diverse project with a lot of different contributors from different companies. And the upstream of the upstream is really just an umbrella for dozens of different projects. And you need documentation at every single point on that graph. So that becomes very difficult. Making it even more difficult is Fedora. This was actually drawn by my colleague Paul Frields during a Fedora Docs FAD we did a couple weeks ago. So we've got, let me see, I've got a laser pointer. Fedora, that's an operating system, a Linux distribution. Fedora has hundreds, thousands of upstreams. Lots and lots and lots of software is packaged and put into Fedora. Fedora comes in 3 main editions: Cloud, Server, and Workstation. Workstation is what's running on my computer right now. Server is what you'd use to run a web server, a database server, what have you. Cloud is kind of a trimmed-down operating system for virtualization and containers. That feeds directly into Red Hat Enterprise Linux. That's our product. Most deployments of Red Hat Enterprise Linux are server, so there's a big fat arrow there, right? That's the big feeding point into RHEL. But then also there are workstation deployments of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. People do kind of large-scale, company-wide deployments, so there's a smaller arrow sticking up there into RHEL. So Fedora clearly feeds into Red Hat Enterprise Linux. But then Red Hat also sponsors the CentOS project, which is a free enterprise operating system. It's Red Hat Enterprise Linux, stripped of all of the trademarks and stuff, so you can do whatever you want with it. And we actually sponsor this so that people can take our enterprise operating system and do things and build things on top of it. So CentOS obviously is a downstream of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Except now CentOS is doing interesting new things on their own. So they're doing stuff in the cloud space, so we've got a little dotted line from Fedora Cloud into it. But they're also doing new development work for server management because that's their, that's where they're kind of positioning themselves, much less so in the workstation space as the server space. So they're doing new work in the server space, and that feeds back into Fedora Server, which then feeds into Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which feeds right back into CentOS. So this stream makes no sense. It's no longer going one way, right? We've got like a whirlpool thing going on, and we need to be able to share content all the way through these thousands of upstreams into Fedora, across these different editions, into Red Hat Enterprise Linux, down to CentOS, and straight back into Fedora. And where do we keep that content? How do we manage all that content when things are on different release cycles? It's a very, very difficult problem. So the overarching thing here is we want to have content reuse. And how do you reuse content? Well, in general, my first recommendation whenever I go into a project and I'm trying to enable content reuse is I tell people to stop writing books. I like you. I'm going to buy you a beer later. All right. So books are these big monolithic things that have a linear narrative, and when you write a book, right, you'll say something like, as we learned in a previous chapter, or you'll do a forward reference. We'll learn more about this in chapter 10. Or even if you don't write that, you kind of assume it in what you're writing, right? You might if someone's reading chapter 5, you assume they know the stuff you already told them in chapter 3. Because if they had bought a book in a bookstore, do those still exist, bookstores? Okay, so if they bought a physical Dead Tree book in a bookstore and they were reading it, why wouldn't they know what's in chapter 3 before reading chapter 5? Of course, that's reasonable. But when you're reusing content, right, you've got an upstream and a downstream and a side stream and I need other directions, left stream and a right stream. And they're all going to take this apart. They're going to pick out various pieces, various topics, sections, chapters, whatever. They're going to reassemble it. They're going to throw some topics out. They're going to add some topics in. And this assumption you have in your head about what order the user has read in is completely out the window. So instead, you have to approach your documentation as topics. So how do we write good topics? A lot of this is very general purpose topic-oriented stuff. There's a lot of benefits of topic-oriented that I'm sure plenty of people in this room can talk to you about. But I approach it as a way to enable content reuse, right? There are other benefits, but that's my primary goal. And so when I do topic-oriented stuff, I tell people that they need to write topics that are small, self-contained. They just contain the amount of information you need to do a particular task. Sometimes you actually need some background information, or you need to have done some other tasks first, right? This happens. So in that case, at the top of the topic, you just be upfront about what's required. You say, this topic assumes you know X, or this topic assumes you've done Y. And then, a person comes in, they say, I know that. They can read the topic, get out of your docs, get on with their life. Or they look at it and say, I might need a refresher. Okay, so they click the link, they go read some more. So cross-link everything, cross-link for background information, but also for related tasks, other things that people might be interested in doing. And don't expect that people have read it linearly. Now, it very well may be that when you write a bunch of topics, that your tool, your publishing chain, whatever you're using, forces you to put things into a linear order, right? If you make a single-page HTML or an EPUB or something, or even your site navigational structure might just be inherently linear. But treat that as an implementation detail, just an artifact of the presentation. Don't assume that that linear ordering exists in the way that you're writing the topics. And all of this is to say that every page is page 1, which deserves much more than a bullet point. Every page is page 1. I didn't invent this saying, right? Don't attribute it to me. Lots of people have said it. I live by it. I love it, right? And the idea here is that when a user lands on some page of your documentation, you have to assume that that is the very first page of your documentation that they've ever read. So if you take any one thing away from my presentation today, you take away this slide, every page is page 1. If you take 2 things away from my presentation today, you take away this slide and a ball. Okay, so I love these things. So there are different types of topics, different things you might be writing about, right? Tasks, troubleshooting, concepts, tutorials, stuff like that. If you've used DITA, it's very codified in there. I don't really care. They're a good guideline. No, I mean, I do care. It's something you should look at and think about as you're writing. It's a nice guideline. But I try not to get too strict about the taxonomy, right? Don't let it confine you so that you have to write within this format. It can inform you, but don't let it restrict you. Okay, we're doing topics. How do we get our documentation team, our product documentation team, to work upstream? Well, it turns out the community is actually a really good source of piecemeal content. They're already out there writing blog posts, right, telling you how to do interesting things. They're out there answering interesting questions on Stack Exchange. They're already producing good content, I hope, or maybe your community isn't, but very often they are. But it's kind of a brain dump, right? It's just out there, it's disorganized, it has no overarching plan or strategy to it. So a good use of a professional product documentation person within an upstream, possibly volunteer community is to help them curate and organize their content and to help them develop a content strategy and a content plan to inform what they're doing and inform the types of deliverables that they're putting out there and how they're putting them out there. And I'll also mention, just in passing, another nice use for a professional docs writer is to connect people to subject matter experts, any sort of other people that are useful to talk to, chances are that you have those connections and your community probably does not. So you can act as a people connector as well. That's a good use of time. But even though you're helping to create this stuff, you don't want to do it all on your own. And you don't want to treat your community as an unpaid workforce, right? If your community, if you got a bunch of volunteers and they get the feeling that they're just chugging out unpaid work for your bottom line, that community is going to atrophy. It won't grow. It'll atrophy and die. People, they need some sense of autonomy to stick around within a community. So you want to do everything within the community. You don't just take a piece of work and do it within your team. Don't go, you need a content strategy. Okay, I'll take this over to my documentation team. Here, it's finished. Do this. Bad. Instead, you want to work with the team and help them develop the content strategy in the open source way. So how in the world do you do this? So one of the things that I've been working on, and it's very much a work in progress, I call content strategy in a box. Now, if you're a professional content strategist working on a product documentation team, there is a lot of stuff you do to develop a good, comprehensive content strategy, right? There's a lot of people you talk to, your support team, your user experience designers, your sales team. You'd better be talking to your sales team to find out what your customers are saying. You should be looking at your issue tracker. If your support or sales team has CMS, some record of their interaction with users, take a look at that. All wonderful stuff. I'm not here to tell you how to do your job as a content strategist. I'm approaching this from the perspective of there are possibly unpaid community people out there who do not have access to the internal resources of a company, and they need to develop something to help them inform their documentation, right? We can't go through a very heavyweight process. We need to be able to do something quickly and easily that can help them develop a content strategy that's decent. Probably not the best thing you'd come up with internally, but decent, better than nothing. So this is a set of exercises that you can go through over the course of a week or during a documentation sprint, which, by the way, I'm a huge fan of documentation sprints. I'm going to buy you a beer too, right? I've done a lot of them. I could give a whole talk. I actually have given a whole talk on documentation sprints before. So I love doc sprints, and I will talk all night about them if you get me talking. So anyway, the set of exercises that you could do in a documentation sprint, for instance, to develop some sort of strategy. So how do we approach this? The first thing, obviously, you need to know who the heck you're talking to. You need to know your audience. So I usually go into these projects. They can't do a big audience analysis. They don't have access to the kind of resources that you might within a company. But I say, let's take our audience, let's split it up into 3 to 5 segments. Don't get hung up on the number, just however many makes sense. So very big picture segmentations. So for GNOME, for instance, one big segment might just be your regular users, people who are clicking around and going about their daily lives. Another one might be your administrators. And I don't mean people who happen to be sysadmins and are running GNOME on their computer. I mean people who are administering a large workstation deployment of GNOME, and they need to keep certain settings and stuff synchronized across these different instances. Another segment might be your third-party developers, the people who are developing stuff on top of your platform. They want to make apps and plugins and cool stuff. And then another very important segment that you should always consider when you're looking at an open source project is the people contributing to the project itself. Having good documentation for people contributing to your project is a really good way to grow your contributor base, it turns out. So whenever you're looking at your audience for an open source project, don't neglect those people. They're very important. Within each of those segments, the segments should be pretty much exhaustive of everybody you're going to talk to. Everybody should fit into one of those segments, possibly more than one, but they should fit into at least one. Then it's nice to pick some samples within those segments. And samples are kind of, this is a really lightweight version of personas, okay? So you're just picking a certain set of circumstances, maybe 3 people within this segment, and giving them some specific details about what they're doing. Obviously, these are not going to be exhaustive of your entire population because that would require talking about every single person that you're writing for, and none of you know that. No, that's impossible. So you just identify a few needs, a few circumstances, and what these can help you do, they can just get the juices flowing. When you start thinking about what people are doing, right? It just gets you thinking, gets you better able to talk about their needs and what they need, and to do user stories. I absolutely love user stories. I didn't invent this format. I'm sure plenty of you have seen it before, but I love it. As a role, I want to task so I can reason. So you want to identify the person, who they are, what segment they belong to, maybe some specifics of their circumstances. Then what are they trying to do? What's the specific task at hand? But very rarely do they really want to do that task. That's a step in something bigger they're trying to accomplish. So what's their overarching reason for wanting to do this? These, by the way, are a lot of fun to do in a doc sprint. You get a team of people together. You can shout stuff out and write it on a whiteboard. You can write it on stickies, throw it on a wall, whatever. A lot of fun, very productive. I'm a huge fan of user stories. I'm such a big fan of user stories, I created another Twitter account at Jedi User Stories, which you should all follow right now. Started it like a week ago, so there's like 10 of them on there. So, as a Sith Lord, I want to kill the Jedi so I can rule the galaxy. I'm telling you who I am. I'm a Sith Lord. I shoot lightning from my hands. I want to kill the Jedi, but that's not my goal in life, right? I want to rule the galaxy. That's my reason. The Jedi they're in the way, right? So that's a small task, killing the Jedi, and the overarching reason of ruling the galaxy. Okay, so we assemble a bunch of user stories. Take your user stories and start turning them into topics. And you will find you have much more topics that come out of this, right? There'll be more topics, more tasks you didn't think of in your user stories. Your user stories generally don't give you concepts, right? They usually give you tasks, but your concepts can grow out of your tasks. As you're writing your tasks, you say, oh, this needs this background information, so we need to create some concepts for this. And then once you have this big pile of topics, assemble it from the bottom up to create a categorization structure. A lot of times people approach the documentation with a top-down narrative. Here's my overall kind of section headers, and then I'm going to fill that in. Instead, the approach that I take is we create these topics, and we start throwing them into buckets. You can do a card sort or an affinity map or whatever your favorite exercise is. Just start throwing things into buckets. Sometimes things will fit into more than one bucket. It might be your tools allow that. It might be you might have to make a decision of which bucket is the best. Don't worry about it too much. The point is just to get these into these categories and not into a linear narrative. And again, your tool might force you to happen to present it as a linear structure, but you don't want to treat it as a linear structure because all of these topics, when you're in a content reuse scenario between an upstream and a downstream, and an upstream's upstream, and then a downstream that feeds back into the upstream, right? All of these topics will be pieced out of whatever categorization structure you make, whatever linear ordering you might happen to have imposed. All of these will be pulled out of there. They'll be put into a different categorization structure. They'll be mixed with other topics that you didn't write. Some of your favorite topics are going to be dropped on the floor. Everything will be recategorized, but the underlying topics will continue to be there. So always bear that in mind. Put them into these categories, not a linear narrative. And that's all I have. And there's my big pile of Twitter handles, so you can follow all of them right now. All right, thank you. All right,